Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the narrative of Jesus and the Samaritan woman in our continuing study of the life of Christ. John chapter 4, verse 1 begins, "Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John," and then we have an explanation in verse 2, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were. So there was baptism taking place. Jesus wasn't personally doing it, but he was involved in that ministry. And as we saw in the previous chapter, the popularity of Jesus was such that the numbers of those who were following him was growing, whereas the numbers of those who were following John the Baptist, those numbers were diminishing. And that had been the cause of some concern of John's disciples. And John the Baptist had said, no, that's okay. It's like when a friend comes to a wedding, he finds it all right that everybody's paying attention to the bride and the groom. I'm not either one of those. So therefore it's okay that people are following Jesus instead of me. But when that news gets out, not just to John the Baptist and his followers, but also to the Pharisees, that's going to be the cause of growing concern and growing hostility against Jesus. And so at that point, verse 3, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee. Now let's look at a map. We see he had to pass through Samaria. If you're in Judea and you want to get to Galilee, in the way is Samaria. And the way Jews traditionally would do this, in fact, even today, if you're down, for example, in Jerusalem, down in the Judea area, and you want to go to Galilee, usually you take I started to say a shortcut. It's not really shorter. Maybe it is, a mile. Well, you go down to the Jordan River, and you follow the Jordan River, and then you get up to Galilee. Or you go along the coast, but you bypass Samaria. Folks are still doing it today. Now they're doing it for slightly different reasons. Because that's, West Bank territory, and there's some political issues. And there were political issues back then. It was the area of Samaria. And the Samaritans and the Jews did not get along. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar. This was the Greek name of the ancient site of Shechem. But now it was known as Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well, and it was about the 6th hour. Now if you go to that place, Sychar, or its ancient Old Testament name, Shechem, the city, and we have it here on our picture, is located in the hollow of a place that has two mountains on either side. Mount Ebal on the one side, and Mount Gerizim on the other. This was the place to which the Israelites had come when they first come into the land after the conquest of Joshua, where they were instructed by the Lord. Half of them came and stood on Mount Ebal, and the other half on Mount Gerizim, and one half pronounced all of the blessings of the covenant, and the other half pronounced all the cursings of the covenant. You can just imagine the sight of this. Well, that had been long ago. But notice where there's a mention made of Jacob's well having been there. And that's done for a reason. When you say Jacob, there's a story about Jacob, about how he had gone and met his beloved Rachel. Now it hadn't been here, not at this well, but way up in Haran, their meeting place had been by a well. And what's more, in the Genesis account, it's a well that was already known to the Genesis account, because previous to Jacob, his parents had also had an encounter. Actually, it had been a servant of Abraham that had been instructed to go to Haran and to fetch a bride for Isaac. And when he had done so, he had found her by a well, by that same well, not the well here in John 4, but the same well where Jacob would later meet his wife. So that there is a bit of a paradigm. The man meets the woman, or in the first place it had been the servant meets the woman, but then Jacob meets his beloved by a well. The next place you see that happening is in Exodus chapter 2, where Moses leaves Egypt and he goes across to Midian, and then he gets to a well, and there he meets the woman who becomes his wife. So it's a bit of an Old Testament paradigm. The man meets the woman by the well, and they live happily ever after. And just in case you might have missed it, Jacob is mentioned twice here in this verse, because now we're going to see a woman coming to a well. It's the old paradigm, but in this case it will be a Samaritan woman. Well, let's look at it. By the way, we're told what time it was, about the 6th hour. Now, the way the Jews reckon time, that would have been maybe 6 hours after sunrise, so around noon. However, John seems, and we'll see this later on, John seems to be using the Roman method of reckoning time. That is the same way we do today. So about the 6th hour very well might have been more like 6 in the afternoon. We'll see. Well, I'm not sure that it really matters either way. But here, Jesus, he's been wearied from his journey. He's sitting by the well. Verse 7, there came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Like I said, there's a bit of a paradigm where we're used to in the Old Testament seeing the well, and the woman comes and the man comes, and boy meets girl, and they live happily ever after. And what we have here in John chapter 4 is not a physical romance like that, but I want to suggest that it is a spiritual romance, where Jesus is going to meet this woman, and she's going to fall in love, not in a fleshly, physical sense, but in a spiritual way. She's going to find her beloved. And so there came a woman of Samaria to draw water. By the way, there's an interesting contrast between her, and consider back in the early part of John chapter 3, where there was another person who met Jesus. That had been during the night, not during the day. That had been Nicodemus. So there we'd had a man, very noble, a ruler of among the Jews. Here's the polar opposite. Here's a woman. She's a Samaritan woman, and what we're going to find out, she's a social outcast. And she's coming to draw water. And Jesus said to her, give me a drink. And then by way of explanation, verse 8, for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. They've left Jesus here. And so this is an encounter. The disciples are not around. As far as we know, no one else is around. It looks just to be Jesus and the woman. And therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, being a Jew, apparently by his dress, by his garb, he was dressed Jewishly. Maybe he had the tassels and accoutrements that a Jewish person would have. She says, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan, and not just a Samaritan woman? And then John explains for us, for Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. This sort of conversation did not normally take place. And she recognizes that fact. And so she asks him about it. Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Now, when you say living water, the Jews referred to that as water that moved, moving water. But I think Jesus is going to take that play on words and to describe something that truly is alive. She said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw with. She's taking his words literally. You have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You're not greater than our father Jacob. And by the way, I think she's sort of throwing this in his face. There's some people that can say things that will intentionally try to get into your skin, and then they'll say it just to tweak you. And it might be, I'm not sure, but I think maybe she's trying to get a rise out of him. You're not greater than our father Jacob. It doesn't say your father Jacob, our father. So she's counting herself among the children of Jacob. She says, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle? And guess what? That's on Samaritan territory. That's our well. But she says, you're not greater than Jacob is. I mean, he did not give living water, the kind of water that he did give water. He dug a well, and they could still continue to drink from that well, but they have to come down and draw from it. And she's asking what she thinks maybe is a rhetorical question. Jesus answered and said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. That's just the nature of drinking water from a well. You come and you drink, and it may quench your thirst for a time. And then after a while, you get thirsty again. Verse 14, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst, but the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. Notice that Jesus is not just in the business of quenching thirst. He is also in the business of providing that which continues to quench thirst. He says, I can do something, I can bring something that will cause a continuing nourishment for your thirst. Well, the woman said to him, Sir, give me this water so that I don't have to be thirsty or come all the way here to drink. She's, sign me up. But again, we get the sense she's still thinking physical water. He said to her, go call your husband and come here. I can imagine her thinking, oh, you had to mention that. Well, the woman answered and said, I have no husband. And that's as much as she lets on. And Jesus cuts to the chase, shows that he knows much more than he is let on. Jesus said to her, you have correctly said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have, in other words, the husband you now have, is not your husband. That's emphatic. It suggests maybe now she's with someone else's husband. And so he said, this, you have said a mouthful. You have spoken truly. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. You see, she has gone just from, well, he's just a Jewish person hanging out by a well, to now recognizing that he is a prophet, that he is speaking more than he ought to be able to know. Verse 20, our fathers worshipped in this mountain. And you, and notice our translation says you people, and the reason it says that is because the you is plural. You all say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. It sounds like she is maybe trying to change the subject. Let's not talk about me anymore and my sin. Let's get into a religious discussion. And Jesus actually goes with her in this direction, at least to a point. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You see, people have been arguing, do you worship in Jerusalem? Do you worship on this mountain? It's like when I hear people saying, do you worship on Saturday or on Sunday? And when's the Sabbath? Maybe the more important thing is just that you worship Him. Verse 22, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. The Jews have an edge up on here because salvation has been given from them and initially for them. But Jesus goes on to say it's not going to continue that way. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. It's not so much where you worship. Oh, certainly God has ordained places in the past. But it's how you worship. And true worshipers are going to worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be His worshipers. And this is a hint that God's going to go and get such worshipers, if not from the Jews, then from other places. Verse 24, God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. Location isn't that big of a deal. Chronology isn't that big of a deal, but it is a big deal to worship God in spirit and in truth, because that's what He is. He is both true and He is spirit. Well, the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, He who is called Christ. We've had that little footnote several times now in John, explaining the word Christ and Messiah are the same thing. And the woman says to him, I know that Messiah is coming. When that one comes, He will declare all things to us. And I think we've gotten away from the theological arguing. There's just a reflection. Well, who's to say when Messiah gets here, He'll tell us? And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am Notice that word he is italicized. It's not actually there in the Greek text. I am. But the he is understood. So it's okay that the translators added it. What Jesus is saying, he is saying that he is the Messiah. Now, he has not been proclaiming himself that way. He will not go out after this and begin proclaiming himself that way. In fact, the first time that we're going to see him publicly announce that he is the Messiah will not be until his trial, when he stands before Caiaphas on the eve of his death, burial, and resurrection. But now in this private setting, it is just him and her, in so much as we know. He gives a positive response. I am the Messiah. Because that's when he says, I am he, Messiah is the subject of the conversation. Now at this point, his disciples came. And quite frankly, they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman, especially a Samaritan woman, and yet no one had the just urge to say, what do you seek, or why do you speak with her? They sort of know better than to question Jesus at a time like this. And so they, even though they're bursting with questions, they keep it to themselves, they keep their mouth shut, good for them, and they don't intrude themselves into this conversation. So the woman left her water pot and went into the city. As far as we know, the conversation ends. And she leaves him by the well with the disciples. She leaves her water pot, which is why she came to the well in the first place. Remember, she came to get water, and she leaves without the water pot, but I want to suggest she hasn't left without water. At least, maybe she didn't get physical water, but what's happened, she's received spiritual water. And when you have received spiritual water, the first thing you want to do, you've already drunk deeply, the first thing you want to do is share it with someone else. And that's what she does. She leaves her water pot, she went into the city, and said to the men, I have to chuckle to the fact that she spoke to the men. Maybe that's all she knew. Women weren't really talking to her, especially the woman of, the husband whose with she's at now. But she goes and she speaks to the men. Come see a man who told me all the things I have done. Is not this? This is not the Christ, is it? The way she words the question, it almost expects a negative answer. I think she believes it's the Messiah, the Christ, but she's not saying that. She says, "Could this be? Nah." But he's telling me everything I did, and I imagine some of the men saying, "Gee, he's telling you what she did." And, gee, maybe he knows what I did. I better go check it out. Verse 30, they went out of the city and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him. While that's going on in the city, the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. Now, she had come for a drink and had left the water pot because she had received a drink they didn't know about. And Jesus and the disciples had gone for food because they were all hungry. And Jesus says, I have received a sort of nourishment, and you don't know this kind of nourishment. Verse 33, so the disciples were saying to one another, no one brought him anything to eat, did he? Did somehow he get a hamburger down? No. And Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me, and to accomplish his work. Do not say there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest. Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes, and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest. I imagine, as you looked up and saw these 2 mountains in the distance and the city, that there were now maybe even a stream of people. And if you go to the ancient world, a lot of them were white. A stream of people coming out to them. A virtual harvest that was coming out of the city to meet Jesus. He says, already he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. Remember how John the Baptist had been doing some sowing in the previous chapter. And now Jesus is about to be reaping. and they can all rejoice. Verse 37, for in this case the saying is true, one sows, another reaps. I sent you to reap for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. And look what's coming our way. Here's the Samaritan woman. She's been sowing seed, and we're going to get to reap. Isn't it absolutely wonderful? From that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified, he told me all the things I have done. So, when the Samaritans came to Jesus, they were asking him to stay with them, and he did stay with them 2 days. And so Jesus has a ministry, a short ministry for a few days with the Samaritan city of Sychar. Many more believed because of his word. And they were saying to the woman, it's no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves and know that this one indeed is the, notice what he's called now, the Savior of the world. He had been called Sir, and then he had been called, you Jews, and then he had been called a prophet, and then Messiah, and now they recognize he is the Savior of the world.